My name is Ruth Anderson. I am 83 years old. And for most of my life, I believed I was married to a man of God. Until the day I walked into a courtroom and discovered I was never legally his wife. Never on paper. Never in truth. Just a woman he had hidden in the shadows for over 50 years, bearing his children like a secret sin dressed as prophecy. That morning, my son Jeremiah had pushed me in my wheelchair through the large wooden doors of the courthouse in Jackson, Mississippi. The state had finally brought charges against Pastor Elijah Turner, my so-called husband, for tax fraud, marriage fraud, and unlawful concealment of multiple families. Families, plural. Not just me. I sat quietly as the bailiff called his name. The room fell still. And when he walked in, wearing his spotless white clergy robe, he had the audacity to nod at me like nothing was wrong. Then the prosecutor turned toward the judge and said, "Your Honor, we will be submitting DNA tests that confirm the defendant fathered at least 12 children with 5 different women in his congregation, none of whom he legally married, including Mrs. Ruth Anderson." My heart cracked in half. 12 children. 5 women. And I wasn't even legally a wife. I remember gasping, sharp and loud. My hand shot to my chest. My daughter held me, but my soul had already left that bench. My life, my church, my identity. It all collapsed like the plaster walls of that fake church building where we first met. And right before the room could settle, the prosecutor added, "One of those women was only 17. And she gave birth in the back room of the church." The air turned to stone. That was when my son, our son, stood up in the courtroom and shouted, "Is that true, Daddy? Is that true?" And Pastor Elijah, my Elijah, just stared at the floor. Not a word. Not a sound. Only silence, like a man caught not by the world, but by the very God he claimed to serve. What you're about to hear is how I got here. How a woman like me, devoted, trusting and God-fearing, became the hidden spiritual wife of a man who led a flock straight into darkness. This is not just my story. It's a warning. Let me take you back, before the courtroom, before the betrayal, before the 7 children I bore for him in silence. 'Cause back then I thought I was chosen. I thought I was holy. But I was only being used. And I didn't see it until it was far too late. What really happened that night in the prayer room? And why did he swear we could never tell a soul? Let's go back to where it all began. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you believe no woman should ever be manipulated in the name of God. This story must be heard. Next chapter coming soon. I was only 27 when I first walked into Greater Revival Tabernacle Church on Willow Creek Road. It was 1969, and I had just lost my husband in a car accident 2 months prior. I had 4 children to care for, a rented house with a leaking roof, and more questions for God than I dared say out loud. The church was small back then, no more than 20 pews and a cracked pulpit, but people filled it every Sunday like it was a palace. The moment I stepped in, I felt a strange peace I hadn't felt since the funeral. Then I saw him. Pastor Elijah Turner. Tall, magnetic, dressed in a perfectly pressed black suit with gold cufflinks that glinted like royalty. He looked straight into my soul when he preached, like God was whispering to him through a fire no one else could see. He didn't just talk about the Bible, he breathed it. After the service, he walked up to me, laid his hand on my shoulder and said, "The Lord told me your pain is deep, but your calling is deeper." I didn't know then that those words would shape the next 5 decades of my life. But they did. First I kept my distance. I was grieving, busy. But Elijah kept showing up, dropping food off at my house, praying with the children, slipping money into my coat pocket at church. He made me feel seen, cared for, loved. Then one evening he invited me to the church after hours. Said God had a message for me. I still remember how the sanctuary looked. Just 2 flickering candles, the stained glass window casting red and blue shadows across the floor. He had me kneel in the center while he walked around me, praying in tongues. At one point he put his hands on my head and said, "God has set you apart. You are my rib. My spiritual wife." I didn't understand. I said, "But I'm a widow." "You're married, right?" He shook his head. No woman owns my heart but you. The Lord took my first wife home early, and ever since, He's been preparing you for me. You are not like the others. Our bond is divine. And just like that, I was His. We never had a legal wedding. No ring. No license. But Elijah told me our covenant was higher than earthly documents. A marriage made in heaven needs no witness on earth, he whispered in the dark. Weeks later I was pregnant. And somehow I was convinced this was God's plan. I wore head wraps and long dresses. I cleaned the church every Saturday. Taught Sunday school. I nursed my baby in the back office while Elijah preached about purity and obedience. He never acknowledged me from the pulpit, never held my hand in public, but when I asked why, he'd say, "Our love is sacred, Ruth. Hidden just like the tabernacle." I told myself it was holy. Until the day I saw him praying over another woman's belly the same way he had prayed over mine. She was crying, saying she was his spiritual wife too. That was the first crack in my faith. I confronted him that night in the parking lot. He grabbed my arm tight and said, "You are not to question the prophet. God uses many vessels, but He chose you to bear the strongest seed. Don't let jealousy rob you of your anointing." I went home shaking, but I stayed, because by then I was pregnant with our second child. And part of me still believed maybe God was testing my obedience. Maybe this was what spiritual warfare felt like. Confusion, pain, hidden love. Then came the third baby. Then the fourth. One by one, I gave my body to a man who said it was God's will. And every time I tried to leave, he'd hold our children, quote scriptures and say, "The enemy wants to tear down what God has joined together." But the real enemy wasn't outside. It was standing behind the pulpit, wearing holy robes and a serpent's tongue. I kept everything secret, even from my own children. They just knew him as Pastor Elijah, their spiritual leader, their uncle. Until one night my eldest, Reuben, came to me crying. He had seen something in the church office, something he wasn't supposed to see. He said, "Mama, why was Pastor Elijah hugging Sister Linda the same way he hugs you?" Froze. Linda, teenager, new to the church. I asked him to tell me everything. And what he said next made me sick to my stomach. Because that was the night I finally realized. This wasn't just deception. This was abuse. I had to make a choice. Stay silent and protect his image. Or speak up and protect the innocent. But could I go against the man I called husband for decades? Could I unravel everything I built in the name of God? Even worse, what would my children think when they found out they were never legitimate in the eyes of the law? Would they blame me? Would they forgive me? The questions piled like storm clouds over my soul. And just when I thought I'd gather the strength to walk away, Elijah came home and dropped to his knees. He was crying, begging. And what he said next shook my entire world. He said, "Ruth, I need to tell you something about your son Jeremiah. He's not who you think he is." But before I could ask what he meant, he passed out right there on the floor. Cold. Silent. And I was left holding the truth in my hands without knowing what it was. What secret was he hiding about my son? And why did his body collapse before he could finish? Please like, comment, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of this story. Someone you know may be walking through the same kind of spiritual manipulation. Let's open eyes together. I stared at Elijah's motionless body on the floor, heart pounding like a drum in my ears. For a moment I froze, half in fear, half in rage. Was he playing another game? Was this some twisted way to escape the truth he almost confessed? I knelt beside him, checked for a pulse. Faint but there. His skin was clammy, breath shallow. Called 911. The ambulance came quickly, flashing red and white against the quiet of our street. The neighbors gathered as they rolled him out on the stretcher. Some looked worried. Others whispered behind their curtains. But none of them knew what I knew. None of them knew that the so-called man of God they adored had turned my life into a web of lies. And I had been the first thread he pulled. At the hospital, the doctors said it was stress, elevated blood pressure, signs of exhaustion. He'd be fine. But my mind wasn't. All I could think about was that unfinished sentence. Jeremiah. He's not who you think he is. What did it mean? The next day, I returned to the house alone. I walked into our bedroom, if you could even call it that. It was more of a storage room where he let me sleep. No photos of us. No wedding ring. Just a narrow bed, a prayer rug, and a small box I'd never opened at the foot of the bed. I don't know what pushed me that day. Maybe it was the years of silence boiling in my bones. Maybe it was the truth trying to claw its way to the surface. But I opened the box. Inside were dozens of envelopes, some sealed, some opened. Birth certificates, bank slips, photos, letters addressed to other women. My hands trembled as I pulled them out, one by one. There was a birth certificate for a boy named Isaiah Turner. Mother Linda Gray. Father Elijah Turner. Isaiah had been born exactly 7 months after I gave birth to Jeremiah. I found another certificate, this one for a girl named Miriam. Different mother, same father. Then I found something else. A handwritten letter, folded carefully in the corner of the box. My name was on it. Ruth, if you ever find this, forgive me. I never meant to hurt you. But there is one thing you need to know. Jeremiah, he's not your son. At least, not by blood. I dropped the paper. My ears rang. What did he mean? Jeremiah wasn't mine. I picked up the letter again, forcing myself to keep reading. He was left at the back door of the church in a basket. You were sleeping in the prayer room that night. I told you he was yours after the delivery because you were unconscious from the labor pains, and the baby you carried didn't make it. I thought I was sparing you grief. But the truth is, Jeremiah is not your biological child. He was a gift from another woman who didn't want him. I claimed him as ours. But he never belonged to either of us. I couldn't breathe. All this time, my son, my flesh and blood, the boy I raised and loved, cried for and fought for, wasn't even mine. Fell to the floor. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I woke, the letter was still clutched in my hand, damp with my tears. For hours I sat with that truth. I raised Jeremiah like my own. I loved him. I fed him, clothed him, taught him to read scripture. And now to find out he wasn't my child by birth, but by deception. My first instinct was to run. But where would I go? I had no real home. No name on a deed. No legal marriage. No social security under his benefits. Nothing in my name but sorrow and silence. Still, I had to tell Jeremiah the truth. He was 45 now. A grown man. He deserved to know. So I called him. I said, "Come home, son. There's something we need to talk about. Something that might change everything." He arrived that evening, confused but calm. He looked just like Elijah, same strong nose, same walk. That made it harder. I sat him down. I showed him the letter. I watched the blood drain from his face as he read. Then he stood up slowly and whispered, "So, I was never yours." I tried to explain. "You were mine." "You are. Maybe not by blood, but..." He raised his hand. "But he lied to you. And you let him raise me like I was his secret. His cover." "No, Jeremiah, I didn't know." He turned away. And then, for the first time in my life, he said something that broke me in a way I never thought possible. He said, "Maybe that's why I never felt loved the same. Maybe I was just a body in your house. A ghost in someone else's story." I screamed his name, but he walked out and slammed the door behind him. I hadn't seen him since. And yet that wasn't even the worst of it. Because 2 days later, while Elijah was still recovering at the hospital, I received a letter in the mail. A formal envelope with a golden seal I didn't recognize. It was a cease and desist letter, from a law firm. Inside it said, "You are hereby instructed to vacate the premises of 127 Willow Creek Road, as you are not legally married to Pastor Elijah Turner and have no claim to the property. Failure to comply within 7 days will result in legal action." I dropped to my knees. Had no home. No husband. no children who still believed in me, and nowhere to go. But I still had one thing left. One quiet, burning thing I hadn't touched in years. My voice. I stood up, wiped my tears, and walked to the closet. Buried behind boxes of Elijah's sermon tapes was an old, dust-covered journal. My journal. 50 years of secrets. Details. All written in black ink. And I knew right then. It was time to speak. But before I could even open to the first page, the phone rang. And the voice on the other end was one I never expected to hear. A young woman, no older than 20. She said, "Hi, is this Ruth Anderson?" "Yes," I replied. I think I might be your daughter." But I had never heard her name before in my life. Who was this girl? And how could she possibly think she was mine? Please like, comment, and subscribe if you believe no woman should ever be silenced in the name of religion. The next chapter reveals a connection I never could have imagined. Her voice was shaky, like she was nervous to even breathe. "My name is Alana," she said. "I was told you're my mother." I gripped the phone tighter. My thoughts scrambled like wild birds in a cage. "Who told you that?" Yes. There was a long pause. "My grandmother, on her deathbed. She said my real mother was hidden away by a church leader. She told me to find a woman named Ruth Anderson. That you were forced to give me up." Forced. I nearly dropped the phone. "No, sweetheart. I never gave up a child named Alana," I said slowly, cautiously. "I've had 7 children with Pastor Elijah, yes. But I never gave away a baby. Not that I know of." But my voice shook, because suddenly I wasn't so sure. There had been a time between my second and third babies, when I bled so much I lost track of what was happening. I remembered waking up in a hospital, Elijah beside me, saying the baby hadn't made it. That it was better not to talk about it. That we needed to move on in faith. What if he lied? Alana's voice broke into my thoughts again. "Please. I don't want anything. I just want to know the truth. Could we meet?" I agreed. The next day we met at a quiet coffee shop 2 towns over. I watched her walk in. Tall, graceful, dark brown eyes just like mine when I was young. She wore a silver necklace with a mustard seed charm. That was something Elijah used to give women in the church. His so-called spiritual wives. I knew it too well. She sat across from me and pulled out a photo. It was a baby wrapped in a blue and gold prayer shawl. Gasp. A shawl. I embroidered it myself. I remembered the gold thread snagging in my needle. I remembered stitching that verse from Psalms around the edge. "I am fearfully and wonderfully made." That baby was mine. I stared at Alana, stunned. "Where did you get this?" "It was in the box my grandmother gave me before she passed. She told me that shawl was from my real mother. From a churchwoman who wasn't allowed to raise her own child." Tears fell down my cheeks. I had a daughter. And didn't even know. Elijah had lied to me again. He'd stolen my baby and handed her off like she was a secret that might ruin his reputation. Alana reached across the table and held my hand. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just wanted to know if you ever loved me." Choked back a sob. "Alana, I didn't even know you were alive. If I had known, I would have burned the whole church down to find you." We held each other for a long time in that quiet little cafe. 2 strangers, tied together by blood and betrayal. But that moment of peace didn't last long. Because that night I received another letter, this time hand-delivered by a church elder. It was from Elijah. A personal letter, scribbled in his unmistakable handwriting. "Ruth, I know everything is falling apart. I know you found Alana. I thought I could keep the past buried, but it's all catching up to me. If you're reading this, it means I've gone into hiding. The church board is collapsing. The IRS is coming. And I can't face what I've done. But before I disappear, I need to tell you the final truth. I took more than just Alana from you. One of the children you've raised is not yours or mine. It was all part of something much bigger than either of us. Meet me at the old revival camp at midnight. Come alone. My hands trembled as I read those words over and over. What did he mean? Which child? And who were they really? Why was this man still pulling strings, even while vanishing into the shadows? The next day, I packed my coat and scarf and drove to the old revival camp, a dusty, forgotten field where we used to hold firelit worship nights. The stage was still there, rotten wood and vines wrapped around the frame. The trees whispered like they remembered too much. I waited. Midnight came. Elijah stepped out from the trees, looking thinner, ragged, like a ghost of the man who once held an entire town in spiritual submission. "Thank you for coming," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Which one?" I asked. "Which of the children isn't ours?" He looked down. "You'll hate me for this." "I already do." He nodded slowly. "It's Reuben." My heart stopped. My firstborn. The boy I loved before anyone else. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. He swallowed hard. "You miscarried the night Reuben was born." But I was already being watched. I couldn't risk the church knowing we'd lost the first, anointed seed. So I took a baby from a hospital 2 towns over. Child abandoned at birth. No name. "I brought him to you before you woke." I fell to my knees. "No," I sobbed. "No. Well, that's impossible." Felt him. I nursed him. I raised him. He nodded. "You did. He is yours in every way that matters. But not by blood." The weight of that revelation crushed me. I had spent my entire life chasing truth in the shadows of a man who gave nothing but lies. He tried to walk away after that. But I stood up. "Tell me something, Elijah," I said, voice shaking. "Was there ever a moment, any moment, where you truly loved me?" He turned back. And for the first time I saw something human in his eyes. "No," he said. "I loved what you gave me. Not who you were." That was the last time I saw him. He disappeared into the woods. No one saw or heard from Pastor Elijah Turner after that night. Some say he fled the country. Others believe he's still hiding in plain sight. But I had no time to chase him. Because that same week legal action began. Church members were speaking up. The other women were coming forward. And suddenly I became the center of the media storm. The woman who bore 7 children for a predator posing as a prophet. Reporters parked outside my home. Neighbors pointed fingers. People whispered, "How could she not know?" But I did know. Deep down I always knew. I just didn't want to believe it. And now everyone wanted me to talk. Testify. To name names. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Because in the middle of all the chaos, something else happened. One of the women from the church, Naomi, showed up at my doorstep. She was crying. And in her arms was a baby. She looked at me and said, "He told me to leave this baby with you. Said you'd know what to do." Then she handed me the child. And whispered, "He's yours now." But whose child was this? And why had Elijah sent him to me? Now, please like, comment, and subscribe if you believe truth deserves a voice, even when it's painful. The next chapter will uncover the final layer of Elijah's twisted legacy. The baby was wrapped in a pale yellow blanket with a faded scripture stitched on the edge. "Train up a child in the way he should go." I stared at the infant in Naomi's arms, my hands frozen in midair. "What do you mean he's mine?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Naomi wouldn't meet my eyes. "He said you'd understand." He said, "This baby has no place else to go. That you're the only woman who's ever loved without demanding anything in return." I blinked. What kind of cruel game was this? But then I heard the baby whimper, and my body moved before my mind could stop it. I took him in my arms, cradled him gently, and stared into his face. He was beautiful. Soft dark curls, tiny pink lips, and eyes that mirrored something both new and painfully familiar. Naomi stood quietly at the door, clutching her purse. "Wait," I said, looking up. "Where are you going?" She stepped back. "I don't want any part of this anymore. I'm not strong like you. I thought Elijah loved me. But now I see. We were all just chapters in his Bible of betrayal." Then she fled. and I was left in my living room holding a baby I hadn't asked for, but couldn't let go. I called my daughter Deborah that night. She'd been distant since the truth came out. Protective of her own children. She answered hesitantly. "Deborah, I need help," I said. "There's a baby here. New one." Elijah gave him to Naomi and told her to bring him to me. There was silence. Then, "Mama, you have to stop letting him control your life. Even from the shadows. This man has stolen your children, your youth, your dignity. And now a baby. I can't just leave the child," I whispered. "You know I can't." Deborah sighed. "I'll come in the morning." That night, I sat awake beside the crib, rocking slowly as the baby slept. My mind replayed every moment of my life with Elijah. Every sermon, every lie, every pregnancy, every time I told myself this was God's will. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of being silent. Tired of shielding a man who never protected anyone. Tired of pretending my pain was holy. So I did what I should have done long ago. I went to the press. The following week, I sat down in front of a reporter from the Mississippi Herald, holding nothing back. I told the full truth. From the spiritual manipulation to the stolen children to the hidden daughter I never knew I birthed. The story hit the papers in 2 days. Spiritual wife of disgraced pastor tells all. 7 children, 1 decade of lies. People in town stopped me at the market. Some hugged me. Some looked at me like I was part of the scandal. But I didn't flinch. Because I had lived too long in the shadows. And I wasn't done yet. The church board fell apart within weeks. Members came forward with their own testimonies. Stories of being groomed, gaslit, and used. Some women were barely 18 when Elijah approached them. Others had children who'd never known who their father really was. The state of Mississippi launched a formal investigation. But still Elijah was missing. Until one afternoon, while cleaning out the last drawer of his church office, I found something I hadn't expected. Safety deposit box key. It was taped to the underside of a drawer. Hidden behind an old stack of tithing envelopes. There was no label, no note. Just the key and a small scripture card that read, "The truth shall set you free." I didn't tell anyone. The next morning I went to the bank downtown, presented the key, and waited as the clerk retrieved the box. Inside were dozens of photos. Babies. Infants with different women. Pictures of Elijah holding them, standing behind them during baptisms, praying over them in quiet corners of his church. And there were birth certificates. Fake ones. Some with altered dates. Others with falsified names. There were checks, thousands of dollars sent to women in different states. And tucked between the files was a will. A handwritten, notarized will. Leaving everything, the church land, 2 houses and multiple offshore accounts, to Ruth Anderson and any children under her care, including non-biological dependents. My hands shook as I read the closing line. If God won't forgive me, maybe Ruth will. I laughed. It wasn't joy. It was disbelief. This man had stripped me of everything, then had the gall to offer me the spoils of his destruction, as if that could undo what he'd done. I took that will straight to the authorities. And with it they opened a federal case. Now I wasn't just a victim. I was the star witness. 2 weeks later I received word. Elijah Turner had been found. He was hiding in Alabama, living under a false name in a trailer park near Montgomery. A neighbor had recognized his voice from a viral clip of one of his old sermons. He was arrested on the spot. When I saw the mugshot, I didn't feel relief. Felt grief. Grief for the years lost. Grief for the woman I used to be. But also power. Because I wasn't done. The next day, I met with a lawyer and filed for legal guardianship of the baby Naomi had left with me. Then I sat my children down, every single one of them, and told them everything. Some cried. Some walked away. But Reuben stayed. He took my hand and said, "Mama, even if I wasn't born from you, I was raised by you. And that's all that matters." That moment healed something deep in me. But just when I thought I could rest, a knock came at my door. A young woman stood there, holding a toddler. She said, "Hi. I'm not sure if this is the right place. But my mother said if I ever needed to know the truth, to find Ruth Anderson." I stared at her, stunned. Because the child in her arms had Elijah's eyes. Was this another one? Another soul wrapped in the fallout of one man's manipulation. I opened the door wide. "Come in," I said. "We've got a lot to talk about. Please like, comment, and subscribe. If you've ever questioned your worth because of what someone did to you in God's name, this story is your reminder. You are not what they did." I watched her step through my doorway, clutching the toddler against her chest like the child might fly away if she loosened her grip. She looked barely 25. Eyes wide, cheeks flushed, body trembling beneath a frayed denim jacket. "I'm sorry for showing up like this," she said softly. "But my mother, she told me things. Things about the church, about Pastor Elijah, and about you." I gently gestured to the couch. "Sit, sweetheart. Tell me everything." She sat carefully, still holding her son close. "My name is Camille. I was born in 1999. My mother's name is Evelyn. She said she used to attend Greater Revival Tabernacle. Until she got pregnant. She told me the pastor told her to leave town. That he said God was displeased with her presence, and that if she ever spoke to anyone, she'd be cursed." My throat tightened. That was Elijah's way. Spiritual intimidation laced in scripture, designed to trap young women in shame. Camille continued. "She raised me in Georgia. Alone. She never spoke about who my father was until her final days in hospice. That's when she told me his name. And yours. She said you were the only one brave enough to speak up. That maybe, just maybe, you'd know if he was telling the truth." I leaned forward. "And your son?" She hesitated. "His name is Zion. I never wanted to know my father. But then I had Zion. And I needed answers, for him, for myself. Evelyn told me you might understand what it feels like. To love a child and be abandoned by the man who made him." Zion squirmed in her lap, then reached out toward me with tiny fingers. He didn't cry. He just stared. And I knew that stare. It was the same one Elijah had the first time he ever looked at me. Quiet, unreadable, intense. I took his little hand and smiled. "He's beautiful." Camille smiled sadly. "I don't want money. Or vengeance. I just want the truth. I want to know what kind of man he was." Sat back. "Do you have a few hours?" She nodded. So I told her everything. I told her how Elijah never married me legally but claimed I was his spiritual wife. I told her how I bore 7 children, only to find out 2 weren't biologically mine, and one I never even knew existed. I told her about Alana, the baby stolen from my womb. About Reuben, swapped like a pawn for reputation. I watched Camille's face shift from confusion to horror to heartbreak. "I always wondered why I hated the sound of church bells," she said softly. "They made me feel trapped. Now I know why." When she left that night, we hugged like long-lost kin. She kissed my cheek and said, "I don't know if he ever loved my mother. But thank you for not letting women like us feel crazy." I stood in the doorway long after she left. But my peace was short-lived. Because 2 days later I received a subpoena. Not only was I to testify in Elijah's criminal trial, I was also being named in a civil lawsuit, filed by one of the church board members, accusing me of complicity, accessory to fraud, failure to report abuse. How dare they? Deborah stormed into my house, waving the papers. "They think because you stood by his side for decades, you're guilty too?" "I did stand by him," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I carried water for a man who burned every bridge and called it a baptism. Maybe this is part of the price I pay." "No, Mama," she said firmly. "He used your faith against you. That's not guilt. That's grief." Still, I felt the shame crawling under my skin. The media didn't help. Local news twisted my story into a half-scandal, half-spectacle. Grandmother of 9 children with cult-like pastor to stand trial. They splashed my old choir photo on the screen like I was the villain, not the victim. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the nursery rocking Zion, thinking of all the children I'd cradled over the years. Children born from manipulation, from false prophecy, from misguided devotion. And yet they were mine. Every last one of them. No matter the origin, no matter the pain. The next morning, I entered the courtroom with my head held high. The judge was a black woman, strong and steady, with tired eyes and a voice like stone. She read out the charges. The prosecutor laid out Elijah's deceit. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly. My knees ached. My back burned. But my voice did not tremble. Your Honor, I began. For 50 years, I served a man who told me he was chosen by God. I bore his children. I protected his secrets. I gave him my body, my money, my silence. But not my soul. There were gasps in the courtroom. I continued. I didn't know I was being used. I didn't know the truth. But I know it now. And I'm here not to ask for pity, but to speak for every woman who couldn't. I saw Alana in the back row. Camille too. Naomi stood beside them, head bowed. My daughters. My sisters in survival. The judge looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. You may step down." The civil charges were eventually dropped. Elijah's criminal trial proceeded. He pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud, spiritual abuse, and tax evasion. The judge sentenced him to 18 years without parole. He would never preach again. Never manipulate another woman in God's name. But that wasn't the end. Because as I stepped out of that courthouse, a group of young women approached me. One of them was barely 16. She said, "Ms. Ruth, my aunt was one of the pastor's victims. She couldn't speak. But because of you, we can." I cried right there in the parking lot. Because I had spent so many years thinking my story was shameful. But it had become someone else's survival manual. And I was just getting started. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you believe women, especially elder women, deserve to be heard, believed, and honored. There's more truth still to come. The trial was over. Elijah was gone. But peace didn't come overnight. Even after his sentencing, his name lingered like mold in the corners of this town. Some still called him man of God, defending him with Bibles they'd barely read. Others blamed me, whispering in pews and grocery aisles that I was either blind or complicit. 7 children and she didn't know, they muttered. She must have liked it. But I had no energy left for shame. Instead, I poured myself into something I never thought I'd do again. Rebuilding women. Started small. Just me and Camille and Naomi in my living room. We met every Thursday night, surrounded by sleeping babies and lukewarm coffee. We'd sit in a circle, sharing stories we hadn't even told ourselves before. The lies, the grooming, the isolation, the loss of self. "I was 19 when he first touched my shoulder in that way," Naomi said once, staring at the floor. "He said God was guiding his hands." Camille nodded. "He told my mama her womb was anointed, that he could feel it through the Spirit." I added. "He said I was his rib, that I was made to be hidden." We laugh sometimes, ugly, exhausted laughter. Because what else could you do after surviving a man who weaponized scripture like a blade? Soon other women joined us. A group of 5 turned into 10. Then 20. Women from other towns, other churches. Some had been victims of Elijah. Others had their own pastors, their own spiritual abusers. But the stories were nearly identical. Men in power using God's name to silence and control. So we gave ourselves a name. The House of Ruth. A shelter for women recovering from spiritual abuse. Not a building, at least not yet, but a movement. Safe space. Voice. I was 83, but I had never felt more alive. Then came the call. It was late one evening when Deborah walked in, holding her cell phone like it was hot coal. "Mama, it's Jeremiah." My heart froze. I hadn't heard from him in months. Not since I told him he wasn't my biological son. I took the phone slowly. "Hello." His voice cracked on the other end. "Mama." I swallowed back tears. "I'm here, baby." "I'm sorry," he said. I was angry, confused. I shouldn't have blamed you. You loved me more than anyone else ever has. I know that now. I exhaled long and deep. "I never cared who gave birth to you, Jeremiah," I said. "You were mine the second I saw you wrapped in that blue cloth." He began to cry. And for the first time since this entire storm started, I felt something break free in me, a weight I didn't even know I'd been carrying. He asked if he could come home. Said yes. But home was no longer just our dusty house on Willow Creek Road. Home was growing. That very week, the mayor's office contacted me. They'd read the article about House of Ruth. They wanted to offer us a small building on the east side of town, a condemned library we could renovate into a community center. Place for therapy, worship, childcare, and recovery. I said yes before they could finish the sentence. We spent weeks scrubbing walls, painting, replacing floorboards. Volunteers came out from 3 counties. Young women, retired teachers, nurses, church folks with broken hearts and good intentions. And then, one afternoon, while hanging curtains in what would become the children's playroom, a woman walked in quietly and stood in the doorway. She wore a floral scarf, swollen. She was holding a small box. I recognized her instantly. Lana, my long-lost daughter. The one Elijah stole from me and gave away like a secret to bury. She had found me months ago and we'd started rebuilding slowly, carefully. But she'd kept her distance, unsure of how to step into a life that had moved on without her. Now she was back. She walked in and placed the box on a table. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said. "She kept everything. Letters, photos, even your old Bible. I thought you should have it." My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, one I hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. It was my marriage certificate, not to Elijah, but to Benjamin Anderson, my real husband, the man I married at 19, the father of my first child, the one who died in that car crash. Gasp, because it wasn't blank like I remembered. There was a second page. And at the bottom of it was a handwritten note, dated 2 years after Benjamin's death. "Ruth, Elijah is not who he says he is. Fear for you. If something happens to me, look in the hollow Bible on the 3rd shelf. You are not alone. Mother Agnes." I dropped the paper. Mother Agnes was the church's oldest member back in the day. A quiet woman who never missed a Sunday. She died in her sleep not long after Elijah took over leadership. Had she tried to warn me? Had Elijah silenced her? Questions swirled again like a storm. I rushed home, ran to the old bookshelf I'd packed away during renovations, and pulled out the 3rd Bible. Sure enough, it was hollowed out. Inside, dozens of audio tapes labeled with dates and names. I took them to Deborah. We played one. Elijah's voice crackled through the speaker. "Leave the girl alone, Agnes. She doesn't need to know. Ruth belongs to me. God has spoken." Then her voice. "I will not be silent, Elijah. She's a daughter of Zion, not your slave." Then static. Then silence. We froze. The tapes were proof. Proof that people had known. That Elijah had manipulated more than just bodies. He'd tampered with fate. Silenced those who tried to protect me. The district attorney took the tapes immediately. They reopened an investigation into Elijah's handling of church leadership, possible foul play in Agnes' death, and the faked marriages that bound multiple women to him without consent. Suddenly, this wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a story about justice. About generations of silence being cracked wide open by one trembling grandmother who refused to die with the truth still buried. But even as hope bloomed, something darker loomed. The night after the tapes aired on local news, a rock shattered my front window. Wrapped around it was a note. "You should have stayed quiet." I held it in shaking hands. The enemy wasn't done with me yet. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you believe the truth will always be stronger than fear. The war is not over, but neither is this story. The glass scattered across my living room floor like ice crystals. My hands trembled as I picked up the rock, its sharp edges still warm from whoever had thrown it. The note attached, crumpled, written in red ink, its message loud and venomous. "You should have stayed quiet." I sat in my recliner, heart pounding like a drumbeat from the past. For the first time in months I felt afraid again. Not just for me, but for Zion, for Camille, for Ilona, for all the women who had finally started to speak. I dialed Deborah's number with trembling fingers. She came within minutes, fire in her eyes and her husband trailing behind with a hammer in one hand and a roll of tape in the other. "We're boarding up this window. But Mama, this can't go on. You need protection." "I don't want to run," I said. "I've run enough." She crouched beside me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "Then we fight. But not alone." That night, I moved into Deborah's guest room. And by morning, a team of volunteers from the House of Ruth had installed cameras, motion lights, and a security system around both the house and the new women's center. If they thought fear would silence us, they didn't know how deep truth runs when women gather around it. Still, the threat rattled something deep in me. Because if someone was willing to threaten me now, after Elijah was locked away, who else was involved? I called the district attorney. She agreed to meet the next day. When I arrived, she looked tired but serious. She handed me a manila folder across the table. "There's something you need to see." Inside were surveillance photos, bank transfers, property deeds. One name came up again and again. Reverend Simon Carter. Froze. Simon had been Elijah's right-hand man. He'd preached when Elijah traveled, handled tithes, managed the private prayer sessions. And he'd been the one to lead Elijah's cleansing circle, where young women were told to purify themselves through submission. I never liked the way he looked at Camille when she first joined us. The DA leaned forward. "We believe Reverend Carter continued Elijah's network after his arrest. He may even be behind the intimidation tactics. He's already moved funds from the church accounts into offshore holdings." And she hesitated, leaned in. "And what?" "He's petitioning for custody of Zion." My world spun. "What?" "He has no connection to that child. He claims Elijah named him guardian in the event of complications. He's arguing that since you have no blood relation to Zion and Camille has no financial stability, the baby should be placed in his care." "No," I whispered. No, this can't be happening." But it was. The man who watched Elijah steal my womb was now trying to steal my grandson. I stormed out of the courthouse and called Camille immediately. She was already crying. "He served me papers at work," she said between sobs. "He smiled the whole time, said I was unfit, that I was confused, unstable, that I wasn't safe for Zion." I felt rage climb my throat like fire. "I'm getting a lawyer," I told her. "A real one. We're fighting this." For the next week we met with attorneys, child advocates, and journalists. We gathered testimonies, audio clips, documents, proof of what Reverend Carter had done during Elijah's reign and after. And yet, despite everything, the custody hearing was still approved. It would be held in 3 days. Barely slept. The night before the hearing, I wandered the nursery where Zion slept, watching the moonlight fall across his tiny face. I whispered, "Your grandmother let fear silence her once. Never again." The courtroom was packed the next morning. Carter walked in wearing a fresh suit, flanked by his lawyers, smirking like he'd already won. Camille clutched my hand so tightly I could feel the bones in her fingers shift. The judge began, asking each side to speak. Carter's lawyer stood and painted Camille as unstable, economically strained, and emotionally immature. They argued she'd been influenced by me, a woman with a history of questionable association to a criminal pastor. I could barely contain my fury. Then it was our turn. Understood. No lawyer. Just me. "Your Honor," I said, voice clear and loud. "I am not the one who failed this community. The men who claimed God gave them permission to steal women's voices, They failed. Reverend Carter stood beside a predator for decades. And now he wants to raise one of that man's children. I turned to the gallery. This child is not property. He is not a legacy. He is a life. A life that deserves to be raised in safety, in truth, not in shadows. The judge was quiet. Then she called a recess. We waited outside, hands clasped, praying like the world depended on it. When the judge returned, she looked directly at Carter. "Reverend Carter," she said, "this court has reviewed the evidence, testimonies, the financial records, the manipulation, the abuse that you stood by and enabled. You are hereby barred from seeking custody of Zion Andrews or any child affiliated with House of Ruth. Permanently." Camille fell into my arms. The courtroom erupted. Carter stood frozen. And then he snapped. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted. "You're all Jezebels." Officers escorted him out. It was over. Now. Later that night, Camille whispered, "I don't know what I would have done without you." I smiled through tears. "You don't have to know. Just live. That's enough." But something still burned in my mind. That note. That threat. It hadn't come from Carter. He was bold, loud, arrogant. The note was quiet, cold, calculated. Someone else was still out there. Someone even closer to Elijah's web. And I intended to find them. Because the war may have started in a church. But it was ending in the light. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you believe cycles of spiritual abuse can and must be broken. The final 2 chapters will reveal everything. The morning after Reverend Carter's outburst and court defeat, I walked through the newly painted halls of House of Ruth with Zion on my hip and Camille at my side. Our little safe haven buzzed with new faces. Young women carrying babies, women in their 60s learning to live again, volunteers preparing warm meals, therapy rooms filled with gentle voices and quiet tears. But peace still had a shadow. Because the note wrapped around that rock hadn't come from Carter. He was loud, predictable. But that threat, that felt colder. Like someone who knew how I thought. Someone who knew me before I even knew myself. That night, I returned home and pulled out the shoebox I hadn't touched since Elijah's sentencing. Inside, old letters, photos, names of women he'd preyed upon. But at the very bottom, folded and nearly crumbling with age, was a page from a guest sign-in sheet from 1972. Greater Revival Tabernacle. Back when the congregation barely had 30 people. The name that stood out wasn't Elijah's. It was Pauline Rivers. I hadn't seen or heard from Pauline in over 40 years. She was Elijah's first helper. The woman who cleaned the church, kept his secrets, ran the donation books, and always made the other women uncomfortable. She used to call us ungrateful little lambs. She wasn't young like us. She was older, more seasoned, and she had this blind devotion to Elijah that chilled even the boldest women into silence. After Mother Agnes died mysteriously, Pauline vanished. But what if she hadn't really vanished? I picked up the phone and called a friend at the local records office. She owed me a favor. "Can you check something for me?" "Yes. I'm looking for Pauline Rivers. Lived in Jackson in the 70s. May go by a different last name now." An hour later my phone rang. "She's still here, Ruth," the woman said. "New name, Pauline Tucker. Lives just 3 streets over from the old church. Owns a bookstore called The Burning Lamp." My stomach turned. I hung up and stared out the window. If anyone had been watching me all these years, it would be her. The next day I walked into The Burning Lamp. The bell above the door jingled, soft like a warning. Bookshelves towered around me. Mostly religious titles, all aged and yellowed. At the far end behind the counter stood Pauline. Older now, but the same sharp eyes. Same tightly pulled back bun. Same judgmental air. She looked up from her ledger and smiled, cool as frost. Well, Ruth Anderson." I stood my ground. "It was you," I said. "You threw that rock." She didn't flinch. "You have no proof of that." "I don't need proof. I got memory. And mine may be old, but it's sharper than you think." She leaned against the counter. You should have stayed quiet, Ruth. All of this, what you're stirring, it'll only bring more pain. You mean it'll bring truth? I snapped. Pauline narrowed her eyes. You were his. You knew your place. Until you opened your mouth and made everything fall apart. I took a step forward. No, he was mine. He stole my life, my body, my children. And you helped him. You were his keeper. His watchman. She didn't deny it. Just looked away and said softly. He saved me once. From a husband who beat me bloody. He gave me a room. Purpose. Told me God still wanted me. So you paid him in silence. She looked at me again, this time with something like sadness. I paid him in loyalty. That was the only thing I had left. I turned to leave. Pauline, I said over my shoulder. You don't owe him any more. He's gone. But those girls out there, the ones he ruined, they're still bleeding. She didn't respond. But as I walked out, I saw her shoulders drop. Like the weight of truth had finally landed on her back. I wasn't sure if she'd ever come forward. But that wasn't my fight anymore. Back at House of Ruth, a surprise was waiting for me. Letter. From prison. From Elijah. I opened it slowly, my fingers cold. Ruth, I've had months to think. Every time I try to sleep, I see your face. Not from the pulpit. But from that night I found you crying in the sanctuary. I thought I was saving you. But now I see I was using you to save myself. I won't ask forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know something. Pauline wasn't just helping me. She was recording everything. Jazz tapes. Of every ceremony. Every confession, every manipulation. She stored them in the basement of the old church. If you want to finish this, really finish this, find them. Froze. Tapes. Proof. Called Deborah. Called Camille. Called the DA. Within hours, we had a team at the ruins of Greater Revival Tabernacle. The church had been abandoned since Elijah's arrest. Windows shattered, pews rotting, pulpit warped with mold. In the basement, hidden beneath a false floorboard behind the baptism tank, we found the box. 17 tapes. Labeled by date, woman's name and subject. One read, Alana, removal and transfer. Another, Naomi, spiritual ceremony. Another, Ruth, anointing for seed. I clutched that one to my chest. We handed everything to the authorities. The DA's eyes went wide. This isn't just abuse. This is organized religious trafficking. A federal investigation opened within days. And within weeks, women from 5 other counties came forward. Women who thought they were alone. Women who had tried to forget. Now they had voices. Now they had proof. And now they had us. But just when I thought the story was closing, I received one last package. Unmarked. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Black and white. Dated 1971. It showed Elijah, holding a newborn, standing next to a woman who wasn't me. On the back of the photo, scribbled in fading ink. She was the first. You were the last. There's still one more missing. I dropped the photo. My hands shook. One more missing. Another child. Another secret. Who was the first mother? And who was the child still lost? Please like, comment and subscribe. The final chapter is coming, and it will answer everything. Next chapter will bring the truth full circle. The photograph lay on the table like a forgotten wound, reopened. Elijah, younger, untouched by scandal, stood smiling beside a woman whose face I couldn't place. But her eyes looked familiar. Not in a passing way. In the way that stirred something deep in the marrow of my bones. And the child in his arms, just a baby wrapped in white cloth, was unnamed, unlabeled. Another child. I hadn't thought there were any secrets left. I believed we'd scraped the barrel dry. That every lie Elijah buried had already come to the light. But this picture said otherwise. Called Deborah immediately. She came over with Camille and Alana. All of us crammed into my small kitchen like anxious detectives. Camille stared at the photo, brow furrowed. That woman, she looks like me. Alana leaned in. Or like me. We were silent for a moment. Then Deborah said, "We need to find out who she is. If there's still one more child out there." "Mama, that means this isn't over." I nodded slowly. "Not yet. But I think I know where to start." I returned to the burning lamp. Pauline was there again, standing behind the counter as if she'd never left her post all these years. I didn't ask permission this time. I marched to the counter and slammed the photograph down. "Who is she?" Pauline looked down and I swear, for the first time ever, I saw her eyes glisten. She reached out and touched the edge of the photo. Her name was Miriam. "Miriam who?" She swallowed hard. "Miriam Turner." My heart stopped. "Elijah's sister." The room went still. I gripped the counter to keep from falling. "He had a sister. She died giving birth," Pauline whispered. "He never told anyone. Said the baby was cursed. Said it was the result of sin and disobedience. He swore me to secrecy." I stared at her. "So what happened to the baby?" She took a shaky breath. "He gave the baby away. Said he couldn't raise a child born out of shame. Said it would confuse the church if people knew." "Do you know where the child went?" asked. Pauline opened a drawer and pulled out a thin envelope. "I've kept this for 50 years. I didn't know what to do with it. But now." I opened the envelope. Inside was a birth certificate. The name on it made my knees go weak. Isaac Turner. Birth date: November 4, 1971. Mother Miriam Turner. Father unknown. Custodian at birth: Pastor Elijah Turner. And scribbled faintly in the corner: placed into foster care, Madison County. I grabbed my phone and called the county records office. The woman who answered promised to check archives. Within 48 hours I had an address. Isaac Turner had been adopted at the age of 3 by a family in Louisiana. He had grown up just 2 hours away, never knowing who he truly was. I didn't know what I'd find, but I got in the car with Deborah and drove. Small town. Modest home. A white picket fence. And on the porch, a tall man in his early 50s stood watering a row of lilies. He turned as we parked. Something about the set of his jaw, the heaviness in his brow, told me I was standing before another truth. I introduced myself. Then I handed him the photo. He stared for a long time, then looked up. "I don't know who you are, ma'am, but I've seen this picture before. My adoptive mother gave it to me when I turned 18. She said it was all she had of my past. She told me my mother died in childbirth. That the man who handed me over wouldn't speak her name." I nodded slowly. "That man was my husband. Well, my captor, truthfully. He raised me under the title of spiritual wife for 5 decades. He left a trail of children and ruined lives. But you're the last one. The one none of us knew existed." Isaac stepped back stunned. "So I have siblings." I smiled through tears. "You have many. And you have a family waiting to love you." He invited us in. We stayed for hours. By the time we left, we had exchanged numbers, plans, and most importantly, truth. For the first time, every known child Elijah had fathered was accounted for. Some were healing. Some still struggled to trust. But all of them had something they never had before: each other. We organized a gathering the next month. Something quiet, intimate, surrounded by trees and songs and softness. The House of Ruth hosted it. Women stood and shared. Children played on the lawn. Tapestries of pain wove into banners of survival. And in the center of it all, I stood holding Zion, the child who started my second awakening. I spoke to everyone: family, survivors, supporters. I used to think love meant silence, that faith meant obedience. But I know now love is truth, and faith is freedom. I stayed quiet too long, but you don't have to. If you are in a place where your voice is buried, dig it up. Even if your hands shake, even if they call you crazy, dig it up and speak. We cried. We danced. We healed. Months passed. House of Ruth expanded. We bought the lot next door, built a shelter, offered trauma counseling, childcare, and legal aid. Women from across the country began to call. Some just wanted to talk. Others wanted to leave everything behind. And through it all, I lived. Not just survived. Lived. At 84, I finally wrote a book. Titled it exactly how it happened. I had 7 children with my pastor. He claimed I was his spiritual wife. It sold out in pre-orders. But it wasn't the sales that mattered. It was the letters. The thousands of letters. One from a young girl in Alabama who wrote, "Because of you, I told my truth. And they believed me." Another from a 70-year-old woman in Illinois. "Your story gave me courage to confront the man who silenced me at 16. And another, handwritten by Pauline before she passed. "Forgive me. I couldn't protect you then. But I see you now. The journey wasn't perfect. Healing never is. But in the end, I didn't need to be called a wife. I didn't need a title. Because I had become something far greater. Truth teller. Protector. A mother of women. And in my final years, I left this world not with silence, but with fire in my voice and justice in my legacy. If this story touched your heart, gave you strength, or reminded you that silence isn't safety, please like, comment, and subscribe. Someone out there needs your voice more than you know. The story may end here, but your power begins now.